dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Hello and welcome to the afternoon agenda on GB News with me, Alex Phillips. Now this show isn't about news as you know it, but opinion and debate on issues that are or should be on your agenda. So with that in mind, here's what we'll be covering today. Barack Obama has taken to the stage at COP26, criticising Donald Trump's record on climate change and pulling America out of the Paris Accord. But is the USA now as committed to tackling global warming as he claims? We'll have analysis with Tom Harwood. Emotions soar as UK travellers return to the US and airlines hail the massive boost to business from the return of transatlantic flights. But how important are they to our economy? And today, we need to talk about sleaze. Oh, don't we just? Is the lobbying row a storm in a teacup, as one government minister has claimed? Or is it time politics has its own great reset? Well, that's the agenda for the next hour. What's on yours? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet me at gbnews. But first of all, it's time for the news with Polly.
Good afternoon, I'm Polly Middlehurst and this is your GB News at 4 o'clock. UK travellers can now fly to the United States for the first time in nearly 2 years. The US has opened its borders to fully vaccinated visitors who must also take the COVID test within 3 days of arrival. I'm sorry, we seem to be rolling the wrong pictures for you there. Children need to be tested 3 to 5 days later. British Airways and Virgin Atlantic synchronised their departures. Those pictures you're seeing there, of course, are of Boris Johnson, who's visiting a hospital in Northumberland today. He says he takes the accusations of government corruption seriously after the government abandoned an attempt to overhaul its misconduct proceedings and prevent an MP's 30-day suspension for breaching lobbying rules. The MP, Owen Paterson, resigned over the scandal. As I was saying, America is now free to travel to if you're double vaccinated from the UK. And incredible pictures today from both British Airways and Virgin Atlantic, who synchronised their flights to mark that moment as they departed from London Heathrow to the US this morning to mark that occasion. Virgin Atlantic CEO Shai Weiss hailed this as a day of celebration.
It's been 600 days that the US border has been shut down for UK nationals. Who would have believed that could be a possibility at all? So to see the passengers coming in early in the morning, grandparents going to see grandchildren they've never met, families reuniting, people going to care for elderly people, and businesses reconnecting is really a day of celebration.
The former US President Barack Obama says larger nations must shoulder more of the burden of fixing the climate crisis. Speaking at the COP26 summit in Glasgow, he said if we don't act, then it's going to be too late for island nations.
But there is one thing that should transcend our day-to-day politics and normal geopolitics, and that is climate change. It's not just that we can't afford to go backward, we can't afford to stay where we are. The world has to step up, and it has to step up now.
A teenager has been jailed for 16 years for murdering his 12-year-old friend after luring him into woodland in Lancashire. The trial heard that 15-year-old Marcel Greshech stabbed Robert Buncis in excess of 70 times and that there was a neck wound consistent with a decapitation attempt. Justice Jeremy Baker told Lincoln Crown Court there was a significant degree of planning and premeditation. Roberts was killed on the 12th of December last year, 2 days before his 13th birthday. Poland has accused the Belarusian government of pushing migrants towards its border in a bid to stoke a major confrontation. It says some migrants have started to push through the border fence into Poland. The Polish government has sent more than 12,000 troops to the border. The European Union claims Belarusian authorities had been encouraging migrants to cross into EU countries via Belarus in revenge for Western sanctions on Minsk over human rights abuses. A dress worn by Amy Winehouse has sold for more than £180,000 at auction. That's 16 times the original estimate. The halter neck was worn by the singer during her final stage performance a month before her death at the age of 27. More than £3 million was raised from the sale of over 800 items, including clothing, handwritten notes and accessories. You're up to date. I'm back in half an hour.
Well, welcome back. We're going to go live now to the House of Commons, where that big debate on sleaze is taking place. An emergency debate on parliamentary standards is just getting underway, following the government lobbying round. Let's have a look.
I granted this debate today because I thought it was essential to sort out the mess we're in. We can start to do that today, but it requires two things for us all: to tone down the party political sniping and focus calmly on making sure the system is effective as it can be, and for everyone to recognise that if we're going to achieve progress, we'll only do so on a cross-party basis. I also want to remind the House that it is not in order to make allegations of impropriety against other named members, unless the House is considering a substantive motion dealing with the issue directly. There are other routes for raising such claims, so please use the routes that are available. I sincerely hope that all members are going to take this approach, and I've recommended that by the end of this debate we have a clearer sense of how we can move forward together on this important subject. So please, let's see the House at its best, as we've certainly seen it as its worst. So, we now come to the emergency debate on the matter of the consequences of the decision of the House of the 3rd of November relating to standards. I now call Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to move that this House has considered the matter of the consequences of the decision of this House on the 3rd of November relating to standards. Firstly, I would like to place on the record my thanks to you, Mr Speaker, for facilitating this debate. And I would also like to put on record my thanks for the work done by all members of staff in this place. I must agree with you, Mr Speaker. I was horrified to learn that the Commissioner for Standards has received death threats. That is appalling. Mr Speaker, no one should receive death threats for doing their job. The role of Commissioner for Standards was one of the key ways that we moved beyond previous scandals which had rocked this House. The role is not political. The Commissioner was appointed by this House to do a job, and that is what she has done and continues to do. Mr Speaker, the actions of the Government last week have tarnished this House's reputation. Last week was UK Parliament Week, a time focused on engaging citizens in the work that we do here. Well, Mr Speaker, if I had been tuning into Parliament last week for the first time, I'd probably have turned the television right back off again. I've only been a member of this place for less than 2 years, and most of the time I'm proud to have been chosen to represent North East Fife, to be able to act for my constituents and to fight their corner. And I was proud to do the right thing last week by opposing the Government and by voting to uphold the standards procedure. It is hard to be proud to be a Member of Parliament when, as a body, we are all tarnished with the Government's brush, when in the eyes of the public we are tainted by allegations of sleaze. The Government's actions last Wednesday have rightly been condemned across the board. Sir John Major said, "The way the Government handled that was shameful, wrong and unworthy of this or indeed any government. Lord Evans, Chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, said that the proposed reforms to the Standards Committee were deeply at odds with the best traditions of British democracy. My inbox, and I'm sure others, are full. To give just one example of many, what gives the government the right to have a vote to change the process just because it has adversely affected one of their own? This is an appalling message to send to the wider public. And I think my constituent is right. What gives this government a right to think that it can change the rules when the decision doesn't suit them? That it can ignore judgments if they are not in its favour? And that it can whip its own MPs to achieve the outcome it wanted in violation of the conventions of this House? Happy to give way to the honourable member.
I'm very grateful for her giving way. Would she agree with me that the other thing that this did was distract from potentially what is the most important set of debates going on at the moment, which is COP26. And when our constituents were tuning into this place, that is what the focus of Parliament should have been. But instead, it was on the shenanigans of this government, and that's the real tragedy here.
Thank the honourable member for intervention. I entirely agree. COP is the last chance saloon for this country, for the planet, and to have distractions in this place is reprehensible.
On that point,
I'll give way.
I am extremely grateful to the Honourable Lady for having secured today's debate on standards. And because when I was first elected to this House, the mother of all parliaments, I was incredibly proud because I thought that members conducted themselves with honour and integrity, that we were not ruled by a Prime Minister who was a tin-pot dictator and who is himself is now mired in sleaze.
Order. We've just said we want to show the House at its best. Tin-pot dictator aimed at an individual, I don't think is going to bring unity. I want to see us at our best that shows that we take this seriously. We want to put the House in the best place forward. So please, moderate language, moderate thoughts. Let's do this right. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. But I do think there's a point here. This is almost the kind of behaviour we would expect to see in the Duma in Moscow, the National People's Congress in Beijing, not in the House of Commons. Now, previous Prime Ministers and previous governments have all had their failings, but it's a long time since we have seen these issues, and the absolute lack of resolve to do anything about it. They say a fish rots from the head down. And I'm disappointed to see that the Prime Minister has chosen not to turn up today to answer questions, given that the Leader of the Opposition is in his place. You can't help but feel that he thinks the rules don't apply to him. The Government has recently failed to properly investigate allegations, failed to declare relevant meetings and arguably attempt to rig the system to cover their own backs. This is a Prime Minister who flew to Afghanistan to escape a vote on Heathrow when he was Foreign Secretary and has driven to the North East to escape questions today.
Run, Boris, run.
I have had correspondence. I'll give way to the honourable member.
I thank the honourable member for giving way and for securing this debate. As one of those who voted against their government or defied their government, the three-line whip, last week on this issue, I think she will agree that it was patently wrong to try and reform a system at this point. We'd had years to reform it. But does she agree that we need cross-party support going forward? Yes. And given that the Committee on Standards is already looking at this issue, we should wait for their findings before making any decisions about going forward?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and I'm sure he was present at the debate last week, which was exactly what this side of the House was calling for. It was calling for consensus, it was calling for the goalposts not to be moved, and it was calling for us to, on an ongoing basis, as we should be doing, look at our processes and procedures and hold ourselves to account as our voters expect us to do. I've had correspondence from lifelong Conservative voters who have been appalled, not just at last week's actions, but sadly the last 2 years of actions by this government and the alarming frequency by which scandals befall them. I'll give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. And does she agree with me that the government has been playing a ridiculous game with the public's trust, not only by the foul play in last week's vote, but also by a string of corrupt dealings over the past 2 years?
I thank the honourable member for their intervention. I will go on to detail some of the things she's referring to. Back in May 2020, Dominic Cummings' trip to Barnard Castle in flagrant breach of COVID regulations. Then it was the Home Secretary found to have breached the ministerial code, but let off. And then the then Health Secretary breaking COVID guidance he had been instructing others to follow. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. I haven't... Yeah, I'll give way.
It has been said in the media that some MPs are now walking through the corridors of Westminster feeling invincible. Does she agree with me that we are accountable to our constituents and they are our boss?
I thank the honourable member for the intervention. I agree that is one of the challenges in terms of this is not an ordinary job. We are not in a line management structure. We are accountable only to our constituents.
Just on that point,
yes.
can I make, as the longest serving benches, can I say to the House, I was appalled at what happened last week. But can I say, as a long-serving member, it isn't typical of the behaviour. I have worked with people in this House on all parties for a very long time, and most of the behaviour is good. It's excellent. It's cross-party. So this has really done something to damage our reputation, but to please don't any of us undermine the fact that normally most of our members on all sides act honourably, work together, and I'm proud to be a member working with them.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. As an MP elected in 2019, one of the things that has been a great loss as a result of COVID has been the opportunity to meet people in real life and actually engage across the House, across parties. And I'm hoping that as we move through COVID, there's more opportunity to do that so that we can see the good behaviour on all sides. Yes, just briefly.
I'm really grateful to my honourable friend, not just for securing this debate, but for being kind and letting me intervene. Absolutely right. In recent weeks, we have mourned the loss of two great men who served their communities well in this House and were decent people. And we've talked about how important it is that we conduct ourselves with grace and forgiveness on all sides, that our tone should be different to that which the public expect. But she also agreed with me that being gracious does not mean ignoring the reality when one side behaves especially badly. We do not need to be soppily neutral. The reality is the government made a decision last week to do something which undermines trust in democracy at every level, locally and here, and that is why her debate is so important.
Thank the honourable member for his intervention. We are the opposition on this benches. It is our job to oppose the government unless it can demonstrate otherwise. I'm going to try and make some progress. Over the last 20 months, my constituents have had to follow more rules than they've ever had to deal with before. While we are sadly governed by ministers who seem to care far less about the rules than any predecessors in living memory, which is why we are here today. Ministers who, arguably, it's been reported over the weekend, are focused on pleasing their boss, not on doing what is right for this country. We've seen story after story break. Cash for honours, undeclared interests.
On that point?
Very briefly.
I thank my honourable friend. On that point of cash for honours, would she agree with me that the House of Lords Appointments Committee should be put on a statutory footing? This would make sure that any recommendations made to the Prime Minister could not be ignored in the same way the Prime Minister ignored advice given to him by the previous independent adviser on ministerial interests when they recommended that the Home Secretary be sacked for bullying.
I thank the honourable member for her intervention. I think these are things that need to all be looked at on an ongoing basis, and there's potentially areas where the different processes are in conflict with one another, but I will now make progress. Who is influencing our politics? How is taxpayers' money being spent? And what is being done to hold those in power to account? And that's why we argue that we do need a public inquiry with the powers and resources to get to the depths of the situation we are in. People around the country who play by the rules deserve answers, and instead they are being let down by a Prime Minister and a government who won't even take the most basic of steps to turn up to this debate. And it is a great shame that the Prime Minister hasn't graced us with his presence this afternoon, because there is still a huge amount that we do not know about the events of last week. And there are many questions that demand answers, and many of those involve the Prime Minister's personal role in this affair. A Prime Minister who's been under investigation more times than any other member in recent years. And the question is, Mr Speaker, who stands to benefit from getting the current standards processes out of the way? And members of the public will have to draw their own conclusions of that, with the Prime Minister not being here today. But the questions don't stop at the Prime Minister. They do extend to those involved in the whipping operation last week. Firstly, why was there a whipping operation in the first place? This was House business. It should not have been whipped.
How did it go?
The government tried to change our procedures without our consent, and then it U-turned and tried to walk it back. But you can't walk back the events of last week. That's why we're here looking forward. We've heard serious concerning allegations today that members breaking the whip were threatened with a removal of funding for projects in their constituency, and I'd ask the Cabinet Secretary to address this and whether it's true. This matter deserves further investigation. The idea that communities should suffer because their representative did the right thing is frankly abhorrent. And even despite all those alleged threats, the whipping operation was only a partial success. And I do thank those members in the opposite benches who stood up for what was right, and those members, including the Father of the House, who supported my application last week. I'll give way to the honourable member.
If you're giving way, I'd just like to make it clear that at no stage were any threats of that nature made to me when I broke the whip last week.
Thank the honourable member for his intervention and for providing us with that clarity. It's unfortunate the Prime Minister is not here to do that. But the final set of questions, Mr Speaker, are for us in this place to answer. Not ministers, not the government, but members of this House. How do we go about rebuilding trust and confidence in what we do here? I hope we will be able, I'm going to make progress. I hope we'll be able to discuss this further today. Mr Speaker, no system is perfect. There is always room for improvement. Certainly, when I previously thought about our process for investigating complaints against members, what I saw last week made it abundantly clear that changes do need to be made. I do find it quite hard to believe that Owen Paterson was able to vote on his own suspension last week, whilst the votes of members currently under investigation were actually critical in the passage of the amendment which saved him. It does look like the equivalent of defendants in a court case also taking part in the jury. And it is wrong, and if we are to make changes, I would argue that must be top of the list of reforms. There's been much discussion of a right to appeal, something we've heard a lot from the government as they try to justify their actions. But I would point out that through the Borders Bill currently going through Parliament, the government is attempting to take the rights of appeal away from asylum seekers. Mr Speaker, no matter what changes are proposed, one thing is clear. Those with a vested interest in tearing up Parliament's anti-sleaze rules shouldn't be given the power to do so. And any amendment to these rules must be done fairly and with proper time and consideration by this House. It is this House which invests the authority in the Standards Committee to act on its behalf in considering the Commissioner's reports and considering whether or not to uphold those reports and the sanctions attached to them. And I'm sure that the Right Honourable Member for Rhondda and Chair of the Standards Committee will use time today to speak about the steps which the Standards Committee is taking and which you referred to earlier, Mr Speaker. As a new MP elected in 2019, I didn't vote in the current rules, but I accept them because they are the rules in place. I'm a member of a smaller party. We do not have representation on the Standards Committee, but those are the rules and we accept them. If the processes are to be changed, that needs to be done properly and with consensus across the House. That's what the Leader of the House should be have been looking to do last Wednesday, to act on behalf of the House instead of his own party. It's what he should be doing today, listening to members' contributions and responding to them, and I understand he's not doing so. Instead, we have the Minister for the Cabinet Office responding to us. So, can he let us know what exact involvement the Cabinet Office has in this House's standards procedures? Certainly, wherever we go from here, without a cross-party consensus, reforms will simply have no legitimacy. Mr Speaker, like you, I hope for positive and constructive contributions from all sides of the House this afternoon as we work out how to move forward from this scandal. And I hope that the Leader of the House and the Prime Minister will engage with this process. In closing, Mr Speaker, one of my other constituents wrote to me saying, "Mr Paterson's resignation is not the end. It must be the beginning of an uncompromising campaign to end the corruption of our politics." I hope that we can begin that campaign in this place today.
The question is, that's on the order paper. I call Minister Bartley. Secretary Bartley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Order. Those who are shouting were as the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister phoned me along with the Leader of the SNP this morning to say neither of them could be with us. So they have given their reasons, whether it's right, wrong or different. I don't make judgments, but I can only say on behalf of both of the two people concerned, both leaders, One is at COP and the other is visiting hospitals in the North East. So that's where the premise is. So I don't need to hear all the way through, where is he? I've explained it. Now you can make your own decisions. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am grateful to the honourable member for North East 5 for securing and opening this debate. The government has been listening carefully to the legitimate concerns raised by honourable and right honourable members on all sides of the House, both during and since last Wednesday's debate. These are vitally important matters to you, Mr. Speaker, and to the whole House. But before I set out the government's position today, I would like first and foremost to express my regret and that of my ministerial colleagues over the mistake made last week. We recognise that there are concerns across the House over the standards system and also the process by which possible breaches of the Code of Conduct are investigated. I will in a minute. Yet while sincerely held concerns clearly warrant further attention, the manner in which the government approached last week's debate conflated them with the response to an individual case. This House shares a collective interest in ensuring that the Code of Conduct reflects and fosters the highest standards of public life. The government fully recognises that the Standards Committee is critical to this, including the important role performed by its chairman, the honourable member for the Rhondda. Of course I do.
Very grateful for giving way. He's already offered one apology. Could I ask him to give another? And that is to residents who live in constituencies that have MPs that his front bench and whips were threatening to withdraw spending in their community just to punish them for thinking about voting for, not voting for the amendment last week. Could you apologise to those residents? They are innocent bystanders, and it's not their fault that they can have money taken out of their community simply because of something that their MP does on a matter of conscience.
I fear, Mr. Speaker, he prepared that intervention before hearing from my honourable friend, who just said that despite voting against the government, that was a misrepresentation of the conversations I held. Of course, I give way to the Mother of the House.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Could he explain why he is doing this debate and not the Leader of the House, whose job it is to deal with the issue of the standards decision? Isn't this adding insult to injury and showing the government just really doesn't understand it?
With your respect, first of all, my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, is here in the chamber with me. And secondly, as she well knows, not least as the Mother of the House, that the Cabinet Office oversees the government response across departments, including on a number of the issues covered by this issue. Of course, I give way one further time, then I'll make progress.
I'm grateful for the right honourable gentleman giving way, and I also appreciate his apology on behalf of the government, and I'm sure other members will do. But can he give the House a commitment that for the future disciplinary matters, they're matters for the House and not for the government?
Well, as has been set out by the Prime Minister and by other colleagues in government, we are committed to working on a cross-party basis, including with the chair of the Standards Committee, and it is for that reason, I'll just make some progress, that reason, as I say, I recognise the important role performed by the chairman, and I just picked that out in terms of my remarks. We thank him, Mr. Speaker, and indeed the committee's lay members for their service, as we do the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards as well. And I want to reiterate the government has previously taken and will continue to take a cross-party approach to issues around standards in this House. Of course, I give way.
I'm very grateful. I too, like my honourable friend, the member for Newcastle under Lyme, received no pressure whatsoever in terms of the way I voted last week. Does my right honourable friend, who set out a very gracious apology in terms of what happened last week, but would he concede that one of the things I think that wasn't right with the amendment that I think the government supported was hand-picking the members of that committee? Would it not be better if the standards of this House are going to be reformed is that the committee should be chaired by somebody who's elected by this whole House, and that the members of the committee are also elected in the normal way of select committee members?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I just set out, we are committed to working on a cross-party basis, and we regret that many honourable members did not feel that they had been sufficiently consulted on the proposals last week. But I simply refer to the article in the Times by the chair of the Standards Committee, who said, and I quote, "I'm sure we need to review both the Code of Conduct and the way it operates," and further went on to say, Mr. Speaker, that there are good arguments in favour of a more formal additional process whereby a member could appeal against the sanction either to an outside body or to a subcommittee or the Standards Committee. It was to that that the debate turned last week, but of course I give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Last week was UK Parliament Week, but it was not our finest hour. Does the Secretary of State for the Cabinet Office agree with me that at the very least a message from this debate must be that we work in our constituents' interest and in the public interest, and that the use of this House to work in private interest to the tune of hundreds of thousands of pounds will not be tolerated?
Yeah. Well, as I said, and of course I hadn't seen that the Chair was seeking to grab my attention, so of course I'll give way. But we are committed, Mr. Speaker, to working on a cross-party basis, and with that in mind, of course, I will give way to.
I'm very grateful, and I acknowledge the apology that the Minister has given on behalf of the government. But I do want to. We are still in a bit of a hole, the whole of Parliament. We still have a motion that was carried last week, which leaves the question of Mr. Patterson's conduct hanging in the air. I gave earlier today a draft of a motion which could be considered by the House tomorrow if the government were to table it tonight, and I think it would have the support of the whole House in clearing up the fact, as you, Mr. Speaker, referred to, that we haven't actually decided whether Mr. Patterson's behaviour was inappropriate. I think the whole House now accepts that it was. And secondly, we've created a committee which I think even the honourable member who's meant to be chairing it doesn't want to be on anymore. So it would be quite a good idea if we could clear this up tomorrow before we go into recess. And I hope he will say now that he's going to table that motion later on today.
Well, I've been very clear, Mr. Speaker, that we will listen to the House and we'll listen to the debate. Well, if the Honourable Lady will just let me answer the Chair's point. Mr. Patterson has now resigned, so it would not be possible for the House to endorse a sanction of suspension. And I simply remind the House that he suffered a serious personal tragedy. He has now resigned. In his statement, he said he wants to continue outside of public life in terms of politics. And therefore, I think we should respect that. And I hope through your office, Mr. Speaker, there will be a way for us to engage on a cross-party basis, and that is what the government will now redouble its efforts to engage on in the days ahead. I give one further time there, and then to the Honourable Lady.
Very grateful to the Minister for giving way, and there isn't anybody in this House who doesn't have the utmost sympathy for Mr. Patterson's plight. But I think we do have to also remember that he did say that he would do exactly the same if the opportunity presented. I'm grateful that the Minister has rendered his apology, but does he not think it more appropriate that the Prime Minister attends and gives his apology? And if I can assist the Speaker, rather than being in the northeast of England defending the conduct of his police and crime commissioners, one who's had to resign over inappropriate remarks and another one who is under investigation.
Well, I think Mr. Speaker dealt with that at the opening of this debate and made clear both the Prime Minister and the leader of the SNP had discussed with Mr. Speaker in terms of the debate today. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Will you give way? My friend giving way. Can I just say, thank you, sir. I abstained last week, and I thank the government absolutely for the apology, which is completely the right thing to do. And I would also like to say on record that despite the fact that I've abstained, and I occasionally have the misfortune to vote against this government, the government continues to be nothing but supportive of both myself and the people of the Isle of Wight.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's helpful to get that on the record. I'll just make some progress. The government will now redouble its efforts to engage on a cross-party basis, and indeed with you, Mr. Speaker, in the days ahead. because we know what we can achieve when we do so. For example, in collaboration with others, my right honourable friend, the member for South Northamptonshire, worked hard when leader of the House to establish the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme, the ICGS. This scheme to which the government is wholly committed is a model that I believe has many strengths. It includes an appeals process and ability to adjudicate complex cases by virtue of its independent expert panel led by a High Court judge. Overall, the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme brings with it the expectation of rigour, impartiality and fairness for both the complainant and respondent. I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. It would be, I think, of enormous help to the House if we could understand the government's thinking on this issue, which the Honourable Gentleman for Rhondda alluded to. The amended motion last week was passed. I voted against it, but it was passed. What is its status now? There seems to be a general consensus that the rules that we deploy with regards to standards are reviewed. Are they to be reviewed under the current auspices or under the auspices of the amended motion last week of some shadow or secondary standards committee looking at it? If we could know that we are going to work through the actual procedures which are in existence today and effectively expunge the amended motion from the record of last week, that I think the House would find helpful.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's clear that the committee agreed by the House last week will not be able to develop proposals without cross-party participation. And that is why, therefore, we're continuing discussions and listening to views across the House about the best way forward. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Thank you to the Minister for giving way. And in an attempt to help the government, isn't the root cause of all of this MPs trying to get paid more, even more, than the £82,000 per year that MPs already get? But I shouldn't have to remind the government that 95% of the public get paid less than MPs. And I shouldn't have to remind the government that being an MP is a full-time job. Chasing corporate cash is quite simply shortchanging the public. So will the Minister agree to help clean up politics by backing my bill to ban second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth and seventh jobs for members of Parliament?
Secretary Bartley. Well, I'm not sure, Mr. Speaker, whether all on his own benches would support that, because there is value in MPs having a continued connection with the world outside of politics, and banning all second jobs would have captured some in this House, for example, who work as doctors or nurses and have supported the NHS through the pandemic. And I would argue, Mr. Speaker, that it makes sense to build on the recent work of the member for Northampton South and the procedure that she developed when leader of the House. And, Mr. Speaker, we share a commitment to a system which encourages and communicates the right values, attitudes and behaviour in a moment, making clear to members that in performing their parliamentary duties, they are expected always to act in the public interest with courtesy, professionalism and respect. I'll take one further intervention.
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way, and I'm grateful to him for his apology for as far as it went. But last week it was quite clear that the government did not agree with the Standards Committee's recommendations in their report. So I'm not clear today. Is the government saying that they now agree that Owen Paterson behaved badly and incorrectly, or are they just saying, apologising today for the process that they imposed on us last week?
Secretary Bartley. What I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, is Mr. Patterson has left Parliament. He has resigned, and therefore suspending him from the House would no longer be applicable. But it is the work of every member to safeguard Parliament's reputation by upholding its principles and abiding by its rules. Moving ahead, our shared responsibility is to identify and seize opportunities to improve the system, to ensure that it is robust and fair, that it commands the confidence of members and our constituents, and that it is aligned with the fundamental principles of natural justice. To that end, Mr. Speaker, I welcome forthcoming contributions from colleagues. I can assure you that the government will be listening carefully to the insights and views of members from across the House.
No, you haven't. You've done it.
Keir Starmer, Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I see the Leader of the House is in the House, so it is a surprise to see the Minister for the Cabinet Office at the dispatch box today. Mr. Speaker, he and I have faced each other across the dispatch box many times, and it's always a pleasure. But I'm sure he, like me, wishes that his days as the night watchman were a thing of the past, defending valiantly against hostile bowling on a sticky wicket of his Prime Minister's creation. It's as if 2019 never ended. Mr. Speaker, that is because last week the Prime Minister damaged himself. And despite the bravery of some members opposite, he damaged his party. But most importantly, he damaged our democracy. We are fortunate in this country. Voters may not always agree with politicians. They often don't. But they do trust that disagreements are sincere, that their representatives are acting in the way that they think is in the public interest, and that we can resolve our disagreements in debate and at the ballot box. But when the Prime Minister gives the green light to corruption, he corrodes that trust. When he says that the rules to stop vested interest don't apply to his friends, he corrodes that trust. And when he deliberately undermines those charged with stopping corruption, he corrodes that trust. And that is exactly what the Prime Minister did last week. And now today, he does not even have the decency to come here either to defend what he did or to apologise for his actions.
Where is he?
Rather than repairing the damage that he's done, the Prime Minister is running scared. When required to lead, he's chosen to hide. His concern, as always, is self-preservation, not the national interest. And it's time for everyone in this House, whatever their party, to draw a line and to send a message to the Prime Minister: enough is enough. We will not stand by while he trashes our democracy. Mr. Speaker, the case of the former member for North Shropshire is simple. Everyone in this House has enormous sympathy for the tragic circumstances in which he lost his wife. His pain and his anguish are unimaginable. And I wish to express my condolences to him, as I did at the time. The Committee on Standards rightly took those awful circumstances into account when considering his conduct. There was a serious and robust process. He had prior notice of the charges against him. He had legal advisers with him. He was invited to appeal against the Commissioner's finding in writing and in person, and he did so. The findings were clear: an egregious case of paid advocacy. He took money to lobby ministers. That is against the rules, as it is in any functioning democracy, and it's corrupt. The Prime Minister should have told the former member for North Shropshire that the right thing to do was to accept his punishment. His duty of care demanded that he do that.
Yes, absolutely.
His duty to defend standards demanded that he do that. Basic decency demanded that he do that. Instead, the British people were let down, and the former member for North Shropshire was let down, used as a pawn in an extraordinary attack on our Commissioner for Standards. Threats to have money taken away from schools, hospitals and high streets unless members voted to undermine the Commissioner. Ministers sent out on the airways the morning after the vote to call for her to reconsider and consider her position. And a sham committee proposed so the government can set the judge and jury for future cases. This was a deliberate course of action, but the government was caught off guard by the public outcry and they've climbed down. But, Mr. Speaker, this wasn't a tactical mistake, an innocent misjudgment swiftly corrected by a U-turn. It was the Prime Minister's way of doing business, a pattern of behaviour. When the Prime Minister's advisor on the Ministerial Code found against the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister kept the Home Secretary and forced out the advisor. When the Electoral Commission investigated the Conservative Party, the Prime Minister threatened to shut it down. And when the Commissioner for Standards looked into the Prime Minister's donations, the Prime Minister tried to take her down. Government corruption. There is no other word for it. And Mr. Speaker, I will in just one moment. And Mr. Speaker, it's said that the Prime Minister doesn't believe the rules apply to him. But it's worse than that. He absolutely knows that the rules do apply to him. His strategy is to devalue the rules so they don't matter to anyone anymore, and to go after those charged with enforcing the rules, so that breaking the rules has less consequence. That way, politics becomes contaminated. Cynicism replaces confidence and trust. The taunt that politicians are all in it for themselves becomes accepted wisdom. And with that, the Prime Minister hopes to drag us all into the gutter with him. No way. It only serves to convince people that things can't get better, that government can't improve people's lives. Progress isn't possible because politics doesn't work. But in the right hands, used in the right way, for the right reasons, politics can work, because politics can be a noble cause to build a better country, to build a better world. And for some, it is also a great personal sacrifice. The plaques in this House to Airy Neve and to Joe Cox, the empty seat where just weeks ago Sir David Amess sat, are testament to that price. If we're to honour their memory, we have to defeat the politics of cynicism propagated by this Prime Minister. I will give way.
I'm grateful to the Leader of the Opposition for giving way. One of the rules that we've always observed in this place is that you don't whip House business. And just about everything that has happened since last week can be traced back to the determination of the government to whip that. Does he share my concern that we've heard nothing from the Treasury bench today, that if we on this side of the House participate in future exploration of the rules, that when they return to this House, there will be no repetition of whipping the votes either for or against them, and indeed without that undertaking it would be very difficult for anyone on this side to accept that what we hear from the Treasury bench is a good faith exercise.
Well, I do share that concern. It would be a very easy thing for the government to say today, and we've got another 2 hours to run in this debate, so there's plenty of time to say it. I will.
I couldn't agree more with the opposition that House business should never be whipped. I just wondered if the Leader of Opposition could say whether he whipped his members last week.
No. We didn't. Our members didn't need whipping to know what the right decision was. Mr. Speaker, there are good ideas across the House about how we can improve standards to restore the trust the Prime Minister has broken. We are willing, there's been talk this afternoon about cross-party working, we are willing to work cross-party and with the expertise of the Standards Committee to make that happen. But let me be loud and clear. We are not willing to work with the government on their plans to weaken standards. There will be no cross-party agreement on weakening standards. There are other ideas. Labour's long called for the MP's Code of Conduct to ban paid directorships and consultancy roles. The current Code of Conduct recognises that those roles are a potential conflict of interest, but it doesn't ban them. We voted to fix that in 2015, but we were blocked by the government. A change along those lines has been recommended by the Independent Committee on Standards in Public Life, but there hasn't been any action from the government. It's time to put that right. Mr. Speaker, in addition, the revolving door between ministerial office and the private sector is in full swing. Ministers can still regulate a company 1 minute and then work for them the next. The Business Appointments Committee is too weak to provide the check and the balance, and it's time to shut the revolving door by banning these job swaps. I will in just 1 second, if you'll give me a moment. In addition, this weekend, we've been reminded of that appalling, inevitable pattern. Large donation to the Conservative Party, a stint as party treasurer, and then an appointment to the House of Lords. The regulator has been ignored by the Prime Minister and broken in the process. There is no doubt the House of Lords needs fundamental democratic reform, but we can act now to toughen the rules over appointments. I did say I'd give way.
I'm most grateful to the Leader of the Opposition. He was, of course, a former Director of Public Prosecutions. And I'm also aware that in 2003, under a Labour government, the Committee for Standards set up the investigatory panel with rules of natural justice contained in it if it were to be implemented, which in this case it was not. Would he, as a former Director of Public Prosecutions, agree that the rules of natural justice could be avoided where an investigatory panel could have been set up but was not?
Well, I understand the point, but let's just remind ourselves of the process here. The Independent Commissioner examines the complaint and comes to a finding. There is then, and the charge is known, and the individual can be legally represented and advised. And I understand the former member from North Shropshire was legally advised throughout the process. The finding of the Commissioner can then be appealed to the committee. That committee can either agree with the Commissioner or disagree. And I'll be correct if I'm wrong. I think on occasion the committee has disagreed, and therefore the appeal has been allowed, and the individual does not face the sanction. Before that committee, the individual, and I think the former member from North Shropshire, can be legally advised. I think he had 2 legal teams in that process, was able to make a statement setting out his case and his defence. Every point that was made in his defence last Wednesday was made by him to the committee, as anybody who's read the report will know. It was rejected by the committee. He was then questioned for a number of hours by the committee members. That is an appeal. That is due process. And can I just say this? For millions of working people up and down the country, that is a much stronger position than they face if they are disciplined in their workplace. And we owe it to them to recommend it. I'll just make some progress. On all of these areas where we can improve, we can work together to restore trust and strengthen standards. But instead, we've been invited into a sham process designed to force out the Commissioner for Standards. And we're told the main problem is that there wasn't a right of appeal, when there clearly is one. And that's why we have no interest in talking to the government about how to weaken the current system. Mr. Speaker, the lack of common ground is fundamental. The government wants to weaken the system because the system keeps investigating and finding against them. The best solution is the simple one. They should change their behaviour. And the Prime Minister should show some leadership. He should send a clear message that the rules apply to everyone and that those enforcing the rules to prevent corruption will be supported by the government rather than forced out. I will.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend for giving way. Doesn't he think, though, that the sham is even continuing today? Because not only is the Prime Minister not here, given the importance of this issue, the Leader of the House is here, which is right because it's a House issue, but is completely silent. And the Minister who's there, in his place, where the Leader of the House or the Prime Minister should be, can't even answer the basic question from either side of the House about how we proceed now and whether they'll accept the recommendation from Chair of Standards Committee.
And thank you for the intervention. I couldn't agree more. The Prime Minister should be here. Leadership is about taking responsibility. And if there's an apology to be made, that apology should come from the top, just as the direction came from the top last week to engage in this business in the first place. I'll just make some progress and then I will give way. The Prime Minister could start by making 3 simple commitments. First, work with us to ensure that the member for Delin faces a recall petition. It is completely unacceptable for a member to be found guilty of sexually harassing junior staff, yet avoid the judgment of the electorate on the basis of a loophole. Absolutely. The government has hidden behind that loophole. It's now time to come out of hiding. Secondly, the Prime Minister needs to agree that no member found guilty of egregious breaches of the MP's Code of Conduct can be recommended for a peerage. The government can't reward bad behaviour and corruption with a job for life making the laws of the land. And third, the Prime Minister must commit to a full and transparent investigation into Randox and the government contracts. Mr. Speaker, what do we know? We know that Randox has been awarded government contracts worth over £600 million without competition or tender. We know that the former member for North Shropshire lobbied for Randox. We also know that he sat in on a call between Randox and the Minister responsible for handling the health contracts.
Shameful.
Against that backdrop, there is obviously a concern that the use of taxpayers' money and the effectiveness of our pandemic response may have been influenced by paid advocacy from the former member from North Shropshire. Correct. So if the Prime Minister is interested in rooting out corruption, he needs to launch a full investigation. If the Prime Minister is interested in restoring trust, we need full transparency with all the relevant correspondence published, no ifs and no buts. Mr. Speaker, last week the Prime Minister damaged himself, he damaged his party and he damaged our democracy. He led his party through the sewers and the stench lingers. This week he had the chance to clean up, to apologise to the country and finally accept that the rules apply to him and his friends. But instead of stepping up, he's hidden away. Instead of clearing up his mess, he's left his side knee-deep in it. Instead of leading from the front, he's cowered away. He is not a serious leader, and the joke isn't funny anymore. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We come to part of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, it would be tempting to each of us on all sides of the House to get into a mud bath and start throwing things at each other. We can go back in time. I've got a little list as well, but I don't think this is the right time. I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Lady from North East Fife for her requesting this debate. I'd like to thank my honourable friend for Wellingborough for saying last week he thought we ought to have this. I think that there's cross-party support for what we're doing now. The only positive thing I can say to the government on this is if they think they're going to make a mistake in future, talk to me first and we can make it together. I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, for acknowledging on Thursday that things had been done wrong and need putting right. I'm sorry to be speaking in advance of the Chairman of the Standards Committee, because I'd like to know what the terms of his motion are, which could restore the consequences of the vote we ought to have taken, or the way we ought to have taken it, on Wednesday, because it's quite clear that this House should have backed the committee. And I think we need to find a way of showing that, and we ought to acknowledge that in future, whether it's a member on my side of the House or on another side of the House, that people who resign from Parliament don't leave Parliament without making a decision on a firm recommendation of the Standards Committee with members of Parliament and with independent members. So I think we need to find a way of making that plain. My honourable friend, the Leader of the House, and my own friend who spoke for the Government say there's widespread support for reforming the system. I'm not part of that support. I believe the system does work, can work, and should work. I'd be interested in knowing what the Committee on Standards wants to recommend, and I'll look at that with an open mind. Just because it was all right for me 18 years ago when I was on the committee with Martin Bell doesn't mean to say it can't be improved. But I would say to the Government, that as well as responding to what we ought to have done on Wednesday, which I think is the point of this debate, I'd like to hear from the Government how they're going to respond to Lord Evans' report, which came out this week, which has 4.5 pages of recommendations. This afternoon is not the time to go through those, but I do think we ought to have a coherent approach which helps to ratchet up our observance of standards, our recognition of standards. And I think that the only thing I want to say, by the way, on the people who have introduced the question of whether MPs should have outside jobs besides being members of Parliament, we do have 100 or so who are ministers, so they've got an extra job as well as being a member of Parliament. We do have those, an example I've often used is Peter Thurnham, who when made redundant, set up his own business, became a successful engineering business owner. Should he have had to give up, should Michael Foot have given up his writing or his royalties when he was here? I think we should take great care about that. But I do believe that any member of Parliament who declares outside earnings should do it not just in writing, but face to face with the registrar and explain what they're doing and can be reminded what the limits are of what they do. Because the one thing I would say to the face of my former colleague, the right honourable member, Patterson, is that the one thing we know, if we take on a consultancy with a business, is we cannot do anything which can be interpreted as lobbying or in the interest of that business. That's the only thing we can say. I'll give way once.
I'm extremely grateful to the Father of the House, and I do declare small earnings as a musician outside of this House, in addition to my very small. Isn't there an additional point, perhaps, that ought to be part of this debate that we could add to the list, that the excellent list that the Leader of the Opposition put forward, and that is around public appointments? Because isn't there real concern that the government's attitude towards public appointments is straying away from the rules as overseen by the Commissioner for Public Appointments, and in particular with the forthcoming appointment of the Chair of Ofcom, where the whole process is being rerun, truncated, and quite frankly there are suspicions being tricked up to favour a particular candidate?
Well, I'm biased in favour of Paul Dacre because he and I were working to get the killers of Stephen Lawrence convicted, charged and convicted. If I was asked if he's the right person to chair Ofcom, I'd say no, but I haven't been asked. But Mr. Speaker, many will want to speak in this debate. I'll try not to repeat myself. I believe the present system can work if we make it work. I think that those of us who find that others have taken a different view to the propriety of what we've done, that we ought to trust their judgment more than trust our own, and not just go on saying, I thought I was right at the time. We can each do things which are wrong. If we do, we should say so, say sorry, and try to let this House move on. That way, I think we can ratchet up the standards of our achievements as well as the standards of our behaviour.
SNP spokesperson Pete Wishart.
Thank you ever so much, Mr. Speaker. And always it's a privilege and pleasure to follow the Father in the House. I want to congratulate the Honourable Lady for North East Fife for securing this important debate, and I think she's introduced it in a means and a manner which is significantly different to what we had last week, and I welcome her comments on that behalf. But Mr. Speaker, what a few days this has been. What a week we have had to endure as politicians who serve in this House. Our politics have been taken to a very, very dark place indeed. The sense that rules have been torn up, The feeling that we've returned to the worst days of Tory sleaze, sleaze that we thought had been buried and gone, never to return. There's a sense of outrage amongst the public that I've never seen in the 20 years that I've been in this place. And this is palpable and tangible into bulging email boxes with angry constituents demanding to know what on earth is going on and demanding that...
Well, welcome if you've just joined us on the afternoon agenda. Here on GB News, we have been watching that emergency debate in the House of Commons on standards in government following, of course, the resignation of Owen Paterson. We'll be dipping back into that if more interesting things come to pass. Well, welcome. If you have just joined the afternoon agenda, I'm Alex Phillips, and this show isn't about news as you know it, but opinion and debate on issues that are or should be on your agenda. So, still to come this afternoon. As migrants throng on the Polish border, Belarus is accused of driving a crisis. What is going on there? We're going to have the latest. Barack Obama makes COP26 sit up and pay attention. But does it make the US commitment to tackling climate change seem more convincing? And it is, of course, at the top of the agenda of most news outlets today, but we do really need to talk about sleaze. Is the lobbying row a storm in a teacup, as one government minister claimed, or is it much, much more serious than that? That's the agenda for the next hour. What's on yours? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet me @gbnews. Well, as we've been watching this afternoon, MPs have been having an emergency debate on standards following Owen Paterson lobbying row. Well, let's talk to Deputy Political Editor for the Daily Mail, John Stevens. John, what's your analysis of what's been going on in the Commons today? There have been some strong words from the Labour leader.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway, to be honest, is that Boris Johnson wasn't even there. He's taken a trip today to a hospital in Hexham in Northumberland. He's trying to get clearly as far away from Westminster in this debate as possible. And I think that actually makes things much worse for the Prime Minister. You know, he could have stood up and given a speech about how he was clearing up the problems of sleaze in Westminster, although that's quite difficult for him when he was clearly integral in the bad decisions that were made last week. But when we did see him at that hospital in Northumberland earlier, he repeatedly refused to say sorry. And then we heard Steve Barclay, the Cabinet Office Minister, who was sent to appear for the government in that debate instead, saying that he expressed regret on behalf of the government. And I think it just shows a lack of leadership that Boris Johnson wasn't able to say sorry himself. He had to leave it to one of his ministers to do that.
Yeah, it was quite striking. And then the apology, in fact, was what? For conflating this idea that the watchdog needs to be reformed with the individual case. And the optics not looking very good. I mean, very empty benches on the government side today.
Yeah, and I think there is a concern that the government still just haven't got this. You had George Eustice, the Environment Secretary, out there yesterday saying that this was just a storm in the teacup. And I think it doesn't really show you any understanding of how mad members of the public are and how mad Tory MPs are, because obviously last week they got ordered to vote for this completely sham committee to look again at the proposed suspension for Owen Paterson for lobbying. He took £500,000 from some companies and broke the rules. The Tory MPs got told they had to vote for it, and then, as we know, the government got forced to U-turn. But we've not really seen Boris Johnson reaching out to those MPs. They have meetings of the 1922 committee. Those are the meetings of the backbench Tory MPs. You could have seen someone like Boris Johnson go along to that meeting tonight and say, we made mistakes last week, we put you in a difficult position, but we've realised the mistakes and this is what we're going to do to make it right. But we've not seen that at all. And in the debate earlier on just now, we didn't really see any kind of sensible plan for what exactly the MPs are going to do. Instead, we saw more rowing between the different parties, and it's hard to see what consensus they're going to be able to build to improve the standard system.
I mean, there were also some rather unedifying revelations about the activities of the government whips as well. I mean, purportedly going around to individual MPs and saying, well, look, if you don't back the government on this, then we're not going to give you any money for your constituency.
Yeah, and Labour clearly think that this is an area that they can keep pushing. It came up several times in the debate. You've also got Labour pushing the government to be explicit in saying that it's not going to give Owen Paterson a peerage. That's something the government so far has been a bit mealy-mouthed about. Off the record, they say it's not on the cards. But when the Prime Minister was asked about that earlier on, he didn't give a clear answer. He didn't give a firm denial that that is a possibility in the future. And you've also got Labour pushing on this argument about what was Owen Paterson doing for Randox, one of the companies that employed him, when it came to COVID contracts. Randox is one of the firms, I think they got about £600 million worth of COVID contracts without a proper tendering process. We know that happened because of the emergency, that there was such a rush to get PPE and testing in place. But there are questions about what exactly were the lines of communications between Owen Paterson and ministers in the run-up to that big decision.
Time that it seems the Conservative governments seem to have favoured their cronies when it comes to contracts. We've heard the revelations about Richard Desmond, a big donor to the party, and questions over the development of particular parts of the UK. We've also seen the newspaper this weekend cash for peerages allegations as well. They do seem to be in a bit of a pickle.
Yeah, and I think this is the problem for the government in not saying sorry and being able to move on for this row. It means that journalists like me are now crawling through all these different elements, looking back about questions about Boris Johnson's holiday to Marbella last month, looking back to investigations into the expensive revamp of the Downing Street flat. And it's just pushed sleeves right up the agenda. And clearly journalists are keep looking at this, and Boris Johnson hasn't done anything to move on the debate and close the chapter of this.
Do you think that this feels reminiscent of previous sleeve scandals that actually had a huge impact on the Major and Blair governments? Could this become a serious headache for Johnson? Or do you think actually what seems to be his approach with rather brushing it under the carpet and saying nothing to see here might actually work out for him?
Well, I think the Labour Party have been pushing this argument for the last couple of years that Tory sleaze is back, and it hasn't really stuck so far. But this row has been going on for almost a week now, and it would be hard to avoid this in the news. Obviously, a lot of it is quite complicated. It's quite Westminster inside bubble. But I think some of the basics are getting through to the public now, and you're starting to see that the Prime Minister's approval ratings have started to go down to their lowest level on record. I think the question is how much of that support is switching to Labour, though. And at the moment, it seems that people are not so happy with the government. There has been some change in the polls, but we haven't seen a surge in support for Keir Starmer. And at these moments, he's sometimes struggled to get cut through.
John, thank you ever so much. Always love having you on, especially when it comes to talking about sleaze. Fantastic to have your insights. John Stevens there, Deputy Political Editor of The Mail. Well, I'm joined now by someone who knows quite a lot about political scandal, Neil Hamilton, who's now the leader of UKIP. Neil, thank you for coming on. You, of course, were embroiled in a Cash for Questions row back in the 90s. What are your feelings about this current situation? Do you have sympathy for Owen, or do you think that actually he was quite right to resign?
Well, of course, I've got a great deal of sympathy for Owen. I've known him a long time. We were at Cambridge together nearly 50 years ago, and obviously we all know and deplore the appalling tragedy of his wife's suicide. I've just today read the Standards Committee report, and I think we're in danger of losing sight of the most important aspect of this is, did he break the rules? Well, yes, he did break the rules. That's perfectly clear. But did it matter? And when you look at what he did, I come to the conclusion, no, it didn't matter. Randox, I'd never heard of it until COVID came along, and we had some Randox tests ourselves. But Randox is a massive company with an expertise in testing, and their testing techniques are vastly better than the ones that the Food Standards Agency was using at the time that Owen Paterson was in contact with them. And so he says, this is his argument, that what he was trying to do was in the public interest. He wasn't seeking to benefit Randox as such. And the committee accepts that Randox has not actually benefited financially from anything that Owen Paterson did. So, I think what we've got to do here is see the wood for the trees, as it were. And whether this firestorm which has now developed is worth the candle, I rather doubt. I mean, the government has made it, of course, immeasurably worse by their own stupidity in the last week. And what was perhaps a storm in a teacup is now very, very much more than that.
But is it not shining a light? I was going to say, does it not shine a light perhaps on a major problem we have here, which it seems to me that when it comes to the rules, there are a few murky areas, a few grey areas. Why is it that an MP, when they're on a salary of over £80,000, which by most people's standards around the country is a good salary, they get, of course, their accommodation in London afforded for them, travel costs, so on and so forth, why are they then entitled to these other jobs that can be incredibly lucrative and could well put them in situations where there do appear to be discrepancies when it comes to whether they're doing the right thing or the wrong thing? Should it not be the case that if you become a public servant elected for by the citizens of the UK and paid for by the citizens of the UK, you have to forego other forms of remuneration?
Well, I think that would be a great mistake, personally. Do we want MPs who are full-time permanent politicians? No, I don't think we do. I think we want MPs who are firmly rooted in the real world. Now, many of the problems that this country has suffered from in the last 50 years is as a result of the race of politicians that's developed as a result of people not having a foot in the real world, whether it's in industry or the trade unions or whatever. So I'm against any attempt to block MPs from doing useful jobs in addition to sitting around on the green benches. But do we want MPs to be paid to be lobbyists? And I think the answer to that must be no. Because that would be reprehensible. And so I think this is the nub of the problem, of course. For example, do we want practicing lawyers to be in the House of Commons? I would say yes, because it's very useful to have people who have a daily practice in the law, as used to be the case many years ago, and indeed in my day. Do we want to have people who have run businesses and still run their own family businesses? I think that would be very useful and would improve Parliament. But do we want people who are just there to act as some kind of stooge for a company to promote their financial interests? I don't think we want that sort of arrangement at all. You're quite right to talk about the sums of money that are involved here. I mean, Owen Paterson was paid something like £500 an hour by Randox for the time that he spent on their affairs, and £8,333 per month he was being paid by them. Other MPs are paid even more. I was just looking today. Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberals, makes £78,000 a year for 120 hours work from his side interest. So that's his hourly rate is even more than Owen Paterson's, £650. Ian Blackford for the SNP earned £38,967 for 32 hours work on his side interest. That's 1,200.
As the people you're listing are not here to respond, and it would be duty bound upon me to put that to them, I'd rather not go through the litany of potential other offences, or they might not be offences. But is this not the problem? You know, if you're listing people who have these outside concerns, is it not the case that they wouldn't be commanding such sums of money if they weren't in positions of influence? This isn't about people who might be business whizzes and therefore get paid 300 quid an hour to have a phone call. It's because they're in extremely powerful positions as elected by the people of the United Kingdom, and that is why they're given these opportunities, and that is improper.
Yes, in Owen Paterson's case, it's actually unclear what he was contracted to do for these sums of money. He didn't have a written contract with Randox. And so one of the complaints of the commissioner, and indeed the committee, was that they couldn't actually tell what it was that Randox were expecting him to do in exchange for this £8,333 a month. And I think that is a matter of public concern. You're quite right. I don't think that Owen Paterson will be paid £8,000 a month by Randox were it not for his position in Parliament. He admittedly had been Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and Randox is based in Northern Ireland, and he's also a practicing farmer, knows a lot about the farming, agriculture and food, and Randox testing facilities are used in that context. So he's got some justification for being taken on as a consultant, but I wouldn't think that the sums of money he was paid are justified by what he could do for them. So I do think that is a matter of public concern. And certainly as far as the public at large is concerned, I think they're right to take the view that this is some kind of taking advantage of the facilities and the position which Parliament gives to members of Parliament. And there's the other issue, which doesn't arise directly out of Owen Paterson's case, of what ministers do after they've left politics. I mean, George Osborne paid hundreds of thousands of pounds a year, and similarly David Cameron paid something like £1 million a year for one of his outside interests. What is it that these people can do for major industries? None of them's got any experience whatsoever of running a business, being involved in a business. David Cameron was just a PR man before he got...
You and I both know, don't we, Neil? It's not always what you know, it's who you know. Now, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts today. And let's hope that this might be a seminal moment in politics where everyone can clean up their act. After the break, as hundreds of migrants gather on Poland's border, Belarus stands accused of creating a crisis. First, let's have a look at the weather.
Hello again. It's a grey afternoon out there for many of us, but rain is mostly affecting northern areas, Scotland, Northern Ireland, parts of northwest England, and it's a little milder for most compared to the last couple of days. That's because we've got this slice of mild and moist Atlantic air in between a warm front and a cold front that's spreading southeastwards across the country. Ahead of it, still some sunshine for parts of East Anglia and the southeast. Doesn't last long. After dark, the cloud sweeps in. And for much of the country, it's a cloudy night. That cloud lowering to give some mist and fog in places. And the wet weather in the northwest will also sink south by the end of the night. Northern Ireland, parts of southern Scotland, northern England, fairly damp. But clearer skies there for northern Scotland and a slight chill in the air first thing under those clear skies. 3 or 4 Celsius in some sheltered spots. Nevertheless, it's a milder start elsewhere with a lot of cloud cover, some mistiness first thing, and the persistent rain continuing for northern England and increasingly parts of Wales, mostly over the higher ground, drier elsewhere. And after that gloomy start in the southeast, it brightens up, 16 Celsius here. But for Scotland and Northern Ireland, well, despite brighter skies, we will also see a fresher breeze and some blustery showers into the northwest of Scotland, Northern Ireland, perhaps sinking south during Tuesday night to affect more eastern and southern areas for a time. Further south again, and we keep this area of cloud through central zones, Wales, Midlands, southwest England seeing some bursts of rain through the night, on and off really, and all that cloud cover keeps temperatures up in the double figures. Further north though for Northern England, for Scotland and for Northern Ireland, some bright spells on Wednesday morning, but further showers mainly towards the northwest. Whilst in the south, a gloomy and in places damp start to Wednesday, with that continuing into the afternoon. Thursday looks mostly dry across the UK with some sunshine towards the northeast. Friday, more unsettled weather in the north.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage. I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Welcome back. Now, Poland has accused the Belarusian government of pushing migrants towards its border in a bid to stoke a major confrontation. It says some migrants have started to push through the border fence into Poland. The Polish government has sent more than 12,000 troops to manage the situation. The European Union claims Belarusian authorities have been encouraging migrants to cross into EU countries via Belarus in revenge for Western sanctions on Minsk over human rights abuses. Well, GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White joins me in the studio now. Mark, it's a fantastically complex and gnarly situation, isn't it? Give me sort of an overview of what's going on.
Yes, well, I mean, it is a growing and very worrying crisis, clearly, on the borders of not just Poland and Belarus, but also Lithuania and Latvia. They've all been subject to migrants who've been, according to those countries, pushed over their border by the government in Minsk. All of this at the sort of the bidding of Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus. And you can see those images today of the latest attempt to get over the border in Poland. This man here with a shovel just trying to dismantle the barbed wire fence there and being sprayed back by the Polish troops. Some 12,000 now being sent to that area to bolster their border, and they are determined, they say, to push the migrants back. So what you have is a growing humanitarian crisis as much as a political crisis in terms of what is happening between Belarus and Latvia and Lithuania and Poland. You have people who are trapped in the middle who have been invited over, it seems, to Belarus, have been put up in hotels there and have been escorted down towards that border. There was some very interesting footage that came out this morning that showed this huge line of over 1,000 people just snaking their way down a highway towards the Polish border, and that was very reminiscent of the scenes we saw in 2015 with this huge caravan of migrants who come mainly from Syria at that time up through the European Union and into countries like Germany.
Do we know how Lukashenko allegedly is sort of conducting and choreographing all of this? Because looking at those photos just then, we're talking serious numbers here. It's not just 2 or 3 odd people that he's been on the blower to and said, "Do you fancy coming staying into a hotel?" This looks like the movement of people on an industrial scale.
Yeah, there are very credible reports, journalism done out in that region, which shows that there are a number of airlines now that are acting on behalf, it seems, of the Belarusian government, that they are opening up routes to Syria, to Iraq, various African countries, and they are flying people over with the offer of being put up for a number of days at a hotel in the Minsk area, and then they're escorted, it seems, down by security forces from the Belarusian government down towards, at the moment, the Polish border, but as I said previously, it was the Lithuanian and to a lesser extent the Latvian borders as well. So this seems to be the model. The EU have been very clear that this is what's happening. They say that it is effectively what Lukashenko is engaged in is an effort to try and destabilise these countries, to push thousands of migrants through the borders to cause this crisis on the border. They want the European Border Agency, to Frontex, to work with the likes of Poland. Poland's adamant they don't want to do that. They want to stop any of these people getting across their border in the first place. The troops that are on the border have been given instructions from Warsaw to resist any attempts by migrants to cross the border and not to accept applications for asylum at the border fence. So, as I say, these people are stuck in limbo. They've been promised by Lukashenko's regime that they could come over, that they would be taken and escorted over the border as easy as that. It's not. They're trying to get back in, some of these migrants back into Belarus to work their way back around somewhere else. The Belarusian forces are preventing them crossing back into their territory. So, as I say, they're cut. At the moment, they're stuck in no man's land and they can't go anywhere. They have dwindling supplies of food. It's absolutely freezing out there at the moment. So it is, on top of everything else, a growing humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, Mark, thank you so much for that fascinating update. Do keep us in the loop as the situation evolves. Thank you. Well, EU 2.0, a bit different from the refugees' welcome days of Angela Merkel. Clearly, a bit more of a fortress Europe mindset, it seems. Now, after the break, Barack Obama's sprinkled some stardust on the climate conference in Glasgow. But is it a case of style over substance when it comes to the USA and action to tackle global warming? We'll be finding out for you. First, it's time for the news headlines with Polly.
Good afternoon. Here are your GB News headlines this hour. MPs are debating last week's vote to block the suspension of Owen Paterson and to overhaul parliamentary standards. The Commons Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, says he granted the emergency debate to sort out the mess and that any changes to the misconduct proceedings must be done with cross-party support. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, is urging full transparency from the Prime Minister, who's not attending the debate. Lib Dem Chief Whip Wendy Chamberlain says the government's actions last week tarnished the House of Commons' reputation. The Health Secretary says penalties for appalling sexual offences will be re-examined following the case of David Fuller. Hospital electrician Fuller admitted murdering, then sexually assaulting 2 women decades before carrying out dozens of sex attacks on corpses in mortuaries. Sajid Javid told the Commons that support had been put in place for the families of the 100 victims identified. Sir Jonathan Michael will chair an independent inquiry into the circumstances around the offences. Teenager Marcel Greshech has been jailed for 16 years for murdering his friend after luring him into woodland in Lancashire. The trial heard that the 15-year-old stabbed Robert Buncis in excess of 70 times and that there was a neck wound consistent with a decapitation attempt. Roberts was killed on the 12th of December last year, 2 days before his 13th birthday. Police in the French city of Cannes have shot a man who attacked a group of officers with a knife. One policeman was stabbed but escaped serious injury as he was protected by his bulletproof vest. The suspect allegedly tried to attack a second police officer and then a third policeman opened fire. Sources say the attacker claimed to have been acting in the name of the Prophet. A rescue mission is underway to save a man who's been trapped in a cave in the Brecon Beacons for 2 days. He's been unable to move after reportedly injuring his back in a fall. At least 8 teams from across the UK have joined the effort to free him. And UK travellers can now fly to the United States for the first time in nearly 2 years. The US has opened its borders to fully vaccinated visitors who must also take a COVID test within 3 days of arrival. Children need to be tested 3 to 5 days after arrival. As you can see, airlines synchronised their departure from London's Heathrow this morning to the United States to mark the special occasion. That's all from me. I'll have a full news update for you in half an hour.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage. I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Welcome back. Former US President Barack Obama sprinkled some stardust on the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow earlier. He was there to bolster America's claims that it's back on track and taking climate change seriously. During his speech, Obama criticised President Trump for pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement and took China and Russia to task over their lack of urgency on global warming. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Some of our progress stalled when my successor decided to unilaterally pull out of the Paris Agreement in his first year in office. I wasn't real happy about that. And yet, the determination of our state and local governments, along with the regulations and investment that my administration had already put in place, allowed our country to keep moving forward, despite hostility from the White House. The $90 billion investment that we made in 2009 helped to jumpstart the clean energy industry in the United States, and markets adapted, and so did consumers. And even when the Trump administration rolled back emissions requirements for automakers, along with regulatory changes and efficiency standards, many businesses chose to stay the course. They kept reducing emissions. They continued the transition to electric vehicles and energy-saving appliances. The ball had been rolling. In the U.S. alone, more than 3 million people now work in clean energy-related jobs. That is more than the number of people currently employed by the entire fossil fuel industry. So despite 4 years of active hostility toward climate science coming from the very top of our federal government, the American people managed to still meet our original commitment under the Paris Agreement. And not only that, but the rest of the world stayed in the deal. And now, with President Biden and his administration rejoining the agreement, the U.S. government is once again engaged and prepared to take a leadership role.
Well, our GB News political correspondent Tom Harwood is up at the COP26 summit in Glasgow and sent us his analysis.
Former President Barack Obama making a more impassioned address to the COP26 assembly. Certainly more energy driven than what has been accused as a bit of a sleepy presence from the United States so far. It was a speech that was warmly and well received from the delegates here at COP26, picking exactly the right note, saying that it was a mistake, almost apologising for withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords under President Trump. And
well, it seems like a bit of the sound got lost in the post with that particular little package from Tom. We'll see what we can do about that for you later. Royal experts are demanding Prince Harry tears up his £112 million Netflix deal and makes a stand over the Crown's portrayal of his mother, Princess Diana. It comes after Princess Diana's friend Jemima Khan withdrew her support for The Crown over its disrespectful script after she broke up with the show's creator. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle signed a deal with the streaming service last year for their new production company to make documentaries, feature films, scripted shows and children's programming. Well, royal expert and editor-in-chief of Majesty magazine, Ingrid Sherwood, joins me now. Ingrid, do you think it's a bit of an uncomfortable juxtaposition, let's say, that Harry is set to make tens and tens of millions from Netflix, and at the same time they seem pretty keen on hosting a range of content on his mother?
I do think that it looks as if Harry has made a pact with the devil being in this case Netflix, because they paid him and Meghan, or are in the process of paying them, a huge amount of money. And we're not sure of the exact sum, but it is millions of dollars. And so far, we've seen nothing. I think the only thing they got in the pipeline is something about Harry's Invictus Games, which, of course we understand he wants to showcase that on Netflix. It'll be terrific for it. But I think that when Harry did the deal, he must have already known how hurtful the Crown series was to his family, because it's already been running for quite a long time. And don't you think he might have thought that maybe it would stop before they got to Diana? Because there was some chat that it was only going to run, for a certain amount of time. And when it came to the present day royals, it was going to be more circumspect. But naturally, that's not happened because it's very successful.
I mean, here is a prince who has spoken a lot about the importance of privacy, and especially through the context of how he feels that his mother was rather vulturized by the world's media and the world's press, that they wouldn't leave her alone. They were fascinated by her. And I think Netflix has about 3 separate programs, if not more, on his mother right now. Are there other people calling for him to take a more principled position when it comes to his work with Netflix? Was Jemima Khan a lone voice?
Well, I think Jemima Khan probably is the first voice that's spoken out, because she's actually was involved in the writing of some of the Diana series, because she was going out with Peter Morgan. She'd been a friend of his for a long time, and they got together and she wrote it with him. She's a good friend of Diana's. Diana has been a friend of her mother's, Lady Annabel Goldsmith, for many, many, many years. So they're quite tight together. And I think that she felt that Diana was not being portrayed in a very sympathetic way. So therefore, the outcry about, well, surely, what is Harry doing being tied to this machine that is actually degrading his mother in a very unattractive way.
And what about from other parts of the royal quarters? I mean, how do they find things like The Crown on Netflix? They take it in good spirits and think, well, actually, it gives the royal family in the UK a bit of a global platform and increases fascination in them once again? Or do you think that they're quite uncomfortable about its existence?
You mean the royal family?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I think they are very unhappy about it. They haven't watched it. As far as I know, most of them haven't watched it. There might have been 1 or 2. And I think they just find it very unpleasant. And it's just, you have to sort of imagine what it would be like if somebody was portraying your mother in such an unattractive light. You'd be really, really angry and hurt. And I think that, Harry really... he's already said, he quite enjoyed The Crown. Do you remember he did an interview with James Corden on top of a bus in LA? And they talked about everything, and they talked about The Crown, and Harry was very careful to be very sort of, kind about the Crown and saying, well, it was quite good. But I think then he later said, when the whole Martin Bashir news, Panorama interview came up, and it was discovered that Bashir had got Diana to do the interview on false pretenses, Harry and William put out a statement saying they hoped that no one would ever go there again and it wouldn't be recreated. And here are Netflix recreating it. So I think Harry should take a stand. He's not going to want to lose those millions, though.
Yeah, I mean, how much longer can this go on for? It's quite clear that Meghan is very interested in getting involved in US politics. At least she seems to be at present, which has caused a fair amount of outrage as she continues to use the title of Duchess, and the royal family, of course, are supposed to be politically neutral. But can they sustain this? Are these projects going to come to fruition, or do you think they're on borrowed time when it comes to the public's fascination with them?
No, I think the public will always be fascinated with them, and probably the more things they do wrong, the more the public will be fascinated. Being fascinated and liking are two different things. And I think that Harry and Meghan are in a position when they actually could give up the Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles voluntarily, rather than having the Queen take them away, and then they'd be free to do what they liked. They've got it. They're Hollywood A-listers. I think they're always going to be Hollywood A-listers, certainly for the foreseeable future. And I think that now it's time to sort of show their respect for the monarchy and say, okay, fine. Meghan wants to get into American politics. Harry wants to do whatever Harry does, looking good and trying to help the planet and doing his American thing. But he's always going to be a prince of the realm. And one day he'll be son of a king. So being a Duke of Sussex is pretty irrelevant, really, to Harry. But for Meghan, it's probably more important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Ingrid, thank you. Always love having you on for a bit of royal gossip.
Thank you.
Ingrid Stewart there, who is the editor-in-chief of Majesty magazine and royal expert. Passengers and airline staff were in jubilant mood this morning after the US opened its borders to British travellers for the first time in nearly 2 years. The border reopened at 5:01 this morning, and the first flights took off from Heathrow at 8:30. Transatlantic flights are a highly lucrative business, and airlines have been hailing the boost. However, all adult visitors will need proof of vaccination to enter the US. It comes as the government is also reviewing its own plans for UK travel. Well, let's speak to the travel expert and blogger, Heather Cowper. This is surely a big moment after all the disruption caused by COVID. But how significant is the return of transatlantic flights? How many of us are jetting over to America on a regular basis?
Well, I think it's fantastic news, really, really exciting that travel from the UK to the USA is opening up today. I think we've, through this summer, certainly I and other travellers have been enjoying travel within Europe, and it's a next step in this road that hopefully is going to be a really positive one of travel coming out of the damage that the pandemic has caused. So really great news today for everyone involved in travel and travellers who love the USA.
And has this also opened up other destinations where the UK, the US would be a fairly important pivotal stopover to reach them?
Yes, that's right. I mean, there are many routes to places like the Caribbean, which I love, which often you do stop over in somewhere like Miami. So it's great that that's a possibility too. The USA is a great transit route, so that's a really important factor as well.
I mean, it is starting to feel a bit like normality is back, but it seems to me like probably not for long. There are murmurings, aren't there, that there'll be restrictions again on travel for those who haven't had booster jabs. And I think I read somewhere that Morocco has recently closed its borders to the UK as well. What's the latest situation elsewhere?
To be honest, I'm not really up to date with all of the countries everywhere in the world. There are certainly quite a lot of countries in Asia, for instance, and China and Japan that are not yet open. Hopefully that will be happening next year. But I think we have to think about the places we can go rather than the places that we can't. A lot of Europe is open for travel, and now the USA is open for travel. And so there's plenty of wonderful places that we can visit. And having travelled widely, as widely as I could during the pandemic, I'd really encourage people who enjoy travel to get out there and to do what it takes, you know, even if there's tests involved, even if there's precautions involved, which is obviously very sensible. When you get there, you're going to have a fantastic time. And of course, for the USA, there are going to be plenty of people who are traveling to see friends and family. I mean, that's such an important step that's happened today to make that possible for those who really want to get out there and see their loved ones.
And how are people in the tourism sector reacting to these rumours that we might be back to the era of test and release and quarantines if we haven't had a third vaccination?
As I say, I'm not really up to speed with that, and I don't really want to, you know, go on those rumours of what might happen. I think that for those that are fully vaccinated, travel is really opening up at the moment, and we have to really enjoy it. Who knows what will happen, but I'm hoping that it's not going to go down that road, that that we are going to be able to travel and gradually and sensibly move back to a more normal travel situation.
Fingers crossed. You and I hope the same thing, Heather. There you are, Heather Cowper, who is a travel blogger, celebrating the fact that, yay, you can now fly to the States again. So good luck if you're going there. Have a good time. Now, today on the afternoon agenda, we've been talking about sleaze, and we've been asking whether the lobbying row, Owen Paterson's resignation, of course, is a storm in a teacup. Oh, lots of you have been sharing your thoughts. Sam says, no, it certainly made my mind up not to vote for Johnson in 2025. Reggie says, no, it needs addressing. I don't have a problem with MPs earning money outside of their Parliament's remit, but they shouldn't be allowed to use their position as an advantage to do so. That's when genuine corruption can become a thing. Harry says, it's the award of hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money based on who you know and how much you pay them, not what you can actually do or following any recognised competition process. Call it what it is. Oh, what is that then? Chris says, no, it's gone on for far too long and we need to put MPs in court who break the rules. Dawn says, no, it's not a storm in a teacup. It's called corruption, and this is probably small fry compared to what's really going on. Alex says, not me, lobbying is a form of bribery. It's pretty shocking that so many people are happy for their politicians to receive such earnings. Rich says, it's not sleaze, it's corruption. But perhaps worse than that, where is the Prime Minister who ultimately has to carry the can? It's corruption, falsehoods, excuses, U-turns and cowardice. You're not an impressed lot today, are you? Brian says, it baffles me how so many people seem shocked that politicians are corrupt. Anyone with half a brain cell has known this for decades. Ben says, I wouldn't call big pharma lobbying major political parties a storm in a teacup. I'd say it's a big problem that needs to be stopped. Derek says, the whole system is rotten to the core. Let them offer their services free to companies rather than getting paid. Many people offer their services free, so why should MPs not do the same? Terry says, what's the difference between businesses paying Conservative MPs and unions paying Labour MPs? Well, now, the poll result on Twitter, where we asked you, is the lobbying row just a storm in the teacup? 55% of you say yes. Well, you 55% didn't email in, did you? 45% say no. You've been watching The Afternoon Agenda with me, Alex Phillips. Join me again from tomorrow from 4 p.m. till 6 p.m. Coming up next, of course, it's the wonderful and gorgeous Miss L. Dewberry with Jubes & Co. So don't go anywhere, and I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great evening.
Hello again. A lot of cloud overnight for many of us, and rain is sinking south across northern parts of the country, but it will be milder as a result, and then it turns drier and brighter during Tuesday. Here are the weather fronts that are sinking south overnight. In between them, a slice of mild Atlantic air that contains an awful lot of cloud, some thick and low cloud across many parts of the country through the night, and these outbreaks of more persistent rain, initially for Scotland and Northern Ireland, and then sinking into parts of northern England and Wales by the end of the night. Clearing skies, meanwhile, behind the weather fronts for northern Scotland. A lot fresher here as we begin Tuesday, but mild and fairly dismal elsewhere. A lot of cloud, some of that low cloud covering hills, and some spots of rain and drizzle just about anywhere in the west, but most persistent over the hills of northern England and Wales. That's accompanied by a keen breeze around Irish Sea coasts. But for Scotland and Northern Ireland, brighter skies, albeit with blustery showers in the north and west. Further south again, and a misty start for southeast England, but sunny spells coming through later with highs of 15 or 16 Celsius. However, we keep the area of cloud and some outbreaks of rain into Tuesday night. It really just lingers across southern parts of the UK with some heavier bursts of rain at times for the Midlands, Wales and the southwest. Northern England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, meanwhile, see clear spells and just a few showers as we start off Wednesday. But in the south, it is a gloomy picture once again. A mild start, but with some outbreaks of rain about. That rain steadily pushing south and easing during the day on Wednesday, but it stays fairly grey and damp in places. Brighter skies in the north with some showers about, but actually plenty of dry and fine weather. Thursday's looking mostly dry, but with a lot of cloud in many places. Friday, more unsettled weather in the north.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else,